even though we have shared a couple of like brief conversations and also shared a couple of bouldering sessions, which I also want to ask you a little bit about.
Sure.
The podcast is fun because it is like an excuse to ask like deeper questions, more substantive conversation with people that you have already met or already known. Like even for Chusuk and Jay, when I had the podcast with them, I learned new things about them. And I don't think it would have been a while until I learned some of those aspects about them. But because we did the podcast, it was in an accelerated form. And I think that from a relationship building perspective, that's a lot more fun for me. So even for yourself, could you, I guess, like give a little bit of background to the people that are listening in terms of who you are, and what you're up to here in Korea right now?
Sure. My name is Brian Sanghee Lee. That's what's on my birth certificate. Born in the U.S., so I'm a U.S. citizen. At the time, my dad was a Korean citizen and my mother was a U.S. citizen. I work as a cross-cultural executive coach. So I help individuals and corporates work more effectively across cultures. And so that includes usually Asia, so China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, work more effectively with the West. So broadly speaking, let's call that America and, USA and UK, those types of places.
Yep.
I grew up mostly in the US. So my childhood, I was going to public schools in New Jersey until I was 13. I decided to leave home, almost like run away from home. I applied to 8 different boarding schools. I ended up going to a boarding school in New Hampshire for 4 years.
Wow.
And then once I got there, I was able to study abroad in Japan, the Bahamas. In college, I ended up going to study abroad in South Africa and Denmark. And I guess over the past 20 years, I've lived in 10 different cities around the world.
That's crazy.
Actually, probably more, maybe 10 countries, and moved around every year or two. Most recently lived in China for about 9-10 years, and then came to Korea during COVID because my parents were based here at the time. And right now I've been nomadic for the past few years. So something like 30 to 50 flights a year, depending on what is happening. Work mostly remotely, and happy to talk about anything you want. Happy to go deep.
When you meet people here in Korea, like English speakers, and they ask you a little bit about your background, like for me, it's easy. I just say I'm Korean American, born and raised in the U.S., just got here 4 or 5 months ago, right? And then it puts a frame of mind for them. For you, when other people ask about your background, do you just say, I'm Korean American, or do you have to go through a whole spiel of your very like unique background?
It depends on whether they want to hear it, if we have the time for that.
Yeah.
I have a public-facing answer, which is that I'm Korean American and I worked in China for many years and moved here recently. But the honest answer is that I identify, I think I was listening to the episode with Jaewoo and Jusuk from last week, and one of their main realizations is that you don't have to choose. You can be both, this identity as well as that identity, and some people will understand, some people won't. I think for me, I don't feel fully comfortable in any country I'm in, but at the same time, I also realize that's my responsibility to either assimilate or at least understand the culture and the language and the customs of the place I'm in, and that I have to build community wherever I go. And that is not easy, but once you're able to build that muscle of how do I situate myself in a new place, how do I make friends, how do I let this culture influence me in a positive way, see the best that this place has to offer, then that makes me much more complex or adds another dimension to my identity. And so I'll start that conversation, and if somebody shows interest and curiosity, happy to go deeper. If somebody starts to get their eyes glaze over and be like, okay, this guy's talking too much about himself, then of course I understand that most people want a tagline. They want the LinkedIn profile, the Instagram bio tag. That's all they really want or ready for or are used to. And if that's what they're available for, then that's what I have to offer. So I try to give as much as the other person's interested in.
Well, especially in Korea, because like even the whole MBTI stuff is like people really want the bucket. Like how do I perceive you, right? And that has been, I mean, I knew that before coming to Korea, that was part of the culture and part of the social fabric is having a very clear understanding for how I should interact with this person.
That's right.
But the world is, with these digital nomads, with young entrepreneurs that are finding success, like the world is much more chaotic and fragmented. And so being able to have that nuance is super important. And it seems like for you over the last, I don't know, decade plus, you've learned that. One of the things that you had mentioned just in your background was at age 13, you decided to go to boarding school.
That's right.
There, like, can you tell me a little bit about that journey or experience? Because I feel like the stereotype for, let's say, Korean parents that immigrated to the States is that they put a lot of pressure on their kids to go to top schools. And you have some of that on your resume. I'm curious in terms of what those early years were like and why you decided to go to a boarding school at such an early age.
Absolutely. I think this will loop back to the MBTI. I do want to get to that.
Cool.
It's such a fascinating part of modern Korean culture. So what's interesting about my situation is that I have an older brother. He's 4 years older than me. And he did not take the same path that I took. So he went to public school in New Jersey through high school. He went to Korean school, 한국학교 in New Jersey. And as far as my parents are concerned, he was a much easier kid to raise. He wasn't very picky. He was always happy. He kind of followed the rules, and he had a plan for himself. I mean, he ended up going to study architecture at Cornell, right? And great program, got scholarship offers. He was in some ways the son, the eldest son who was able to fulfill all those responsibilities. And I know you have siblings. So maybe you can relate to the idea that, one sibling will follow the conventional path or maybe get married, have kids, maybe be a good Christian, whatever your parents expect of you. There's usually one sibling that can fulfill that role.
Sure.
And in my experience, typically the eldest has a bit more of that pressure because it's the first kid. All of the relatives have eyes on them. And so they're sort of the representative, the 대표 for the family. And so that gives me a bit of flexibility because he was already on that track. More of a traditional Korean male figure, at least compared to me. It gave me the freedom to be a bit more flexible. And the downside of that is I was not a typical kid. I did not like my school. I did not like the way my parents raised me, for example. I would see that my white and black friends in New Jersey would have sleepovers, would go to all of the fun festivals, the Halloween parade, etc. And my mom didn't fully understand or appreciate all of those social events or the value of those events. There'd always be something holding me back. For example, she might want me to practice my cello or my piano instead of going to those events. And I remember, I don't think my parents see it this way, but as a kid, I remember having very intense frustration towards my parents. Like, I want to be like the other American kids. How come it's so difficult for me? And, there would be times where American people would correct my English. Even though I spoke English fluently, there'd be some things that I didn't understand culturally. Maybe it was my sense of humor. I remember having teachers telling me that I was too polite or too rigid at school, and I could loosen up. I could call them by their first name. I could have a sense of humor. And, when I was 8 or 9, I was unable to have the confidence to say, well, this is part of my culture. Part of me being respectful to you is what I was taught by my parents, and that's valuable in its own way. I didn't have that vocabulary. All I knew was I'm not fitting in as much as I want to. And this all led to this association that Korean culture was holding me back. And I wasn't really Korean. I was American. I grew up in America and had American friends. And one thing that makes me different from, let's say, your average Korean American from New Jersey is that I didn't grow up in a Korean town.
Interesting.
Right? New Jersey, well, first of all, Koreans like to gather together and live in communities together. And so that tends to be New York, New Jersey, LA, maybe Atlanta. I'm sure Chicago has some population. But and then they go to church together, they shop in the same places together, socialize together. My parents didn't quite have that. We were a little bit in between maybe Edison and Princeton, but day to day we wouldn't see other Korean people. And my school had maybe 2 or 3 Koreans that I was kind of friendly with. But I didn't feel very Korean until I decided that I wanted to leave home. I decided I want more challenge in school. I wanted a different group of friends. And I wanted the independence from my parents. Like the way that they wanted to set up the parent-child relationship was not what was comfortable for me. And so I decided to apply to boarding schools with financial aid so that I could get out of there. And I remember my parents wanted me to apply to the schools close to home. They wanted me, if I was to go to private school, which they weren't even very confident about, they said, why don't you just go to Princeton Day School, which is 20 minutes down the road, and you could just commute. And I said, absolutely not. I'm not going to be a boarding student in New Jersey. I want to apply to schools in New England and all over. Wow. So I ended up going to a school in New Hampshire that was 6 hours north of where we lived. And transformative experience, because I had classmates from all over the country, all over the world. I think we had 10% of our student body be Korean in some form. So we had Koreans from Europe, Koreans in Korea, Koreans went to international schools in Korea and then came over. There were Koreans who grew up in Korea but then went to boarding middle schools in the States and were kind of had the pedigree of pursuing the best education in America. So it was a very interesting cohort, and it made me confront that I was indeed more Korean than I understood, because I got along much better with those international students than I did with the preppy, waspy, New England, old money prep school kids.
Sure.
I was there on financial aid. It didn't come from that background. And I ended up joining the breakdancing club, which was half Korean, half black and brown. I also joined the step team, which was 90% black and brown. I found refuge in those cultures because I felt like a minority, which was weird because I didn't feel that in New Jersey, even though I was. I didn't have the sense that I was super Asian or super different until I went to New England, and suddenly my race, my class, all of that mattered a lot more. And then it took me some time to evolve my thinking from identifying as American to then Asian. And then I started spending summers in Korea more. So coming here more frequently, I found out that I was part Korean, in the sense that I'm ethnically Korean, but in terms of my culture, my software, not quite. Right. Some things, yes. And then eventually I realized that the Koreanness that I was taught from my parents was not even what modern Korea is. So like immigrant Korean culture, Korean American diaspora, any diaspora culture ends up preserving certain traditional elements or being conservative in certain ways, where modern Korea continues to evolve. And if you look at K-pop now, it's racy, it's sexy, it's rebellious. It's a lot of things that my parents' generation actually doesn't value. And Korea is one of these places with lots of paradoxes or a lot of contradictions, because different generations, different genders, different subcultures all coexist, and they all represent parts of Korea. But then when we think about Korea as one country, one culture, you kind of lose that nuance. Anyway, long story short, going to boarding school was really transformative for me. Put me on a different path from my brother, from my friends back home. And then that made it actually easier for me later to decide to leave America altogether and go to China. And I had a full rebirth as a person in China, because they don't care whether I'm Korean or American. They care about whether I can speak Chinese. They care about, I was doing my research on education in China, and I helped start a school in China. And so my relevance or my social value in China was not pegged to that specific pigeonhole identity. Because yes, I have lots of privilege in China as an American, as an English speaker, as a Korean. But most people just had no preconceptions of who I should be or what I should do. They just knew that I spoke some Chinese, and that was great. And they were very encouraging and very welcoming. And I got to reinvent my social identity, my professional identity. And this brings us back to MBTI, because when I'm in America, I have a specific personality or way I present myself. And I have a much different identity when I'm around Koreans. And then I have a very different identity when I'm around Chinese people or just traveling on my own.
Yep.
And so the great fallacy of any of these personality tests is that your personality is highly dependent on your environment and it's circumstantial and it's subject to change over time. And how do you capture that in a personality test, right? Inevitably, it's a snapshot of who you are when you took the test. It's also a snapshot of who you want to be, not necessarily who you are. And, you know, my bachelor's was in psychology, so I think a lot about these questions of how do we design tests that actually test what we're looking for? How do we make sure there's no bias in our research? And of course, as a coach, I have to constantly think about how is my culture and my presence affecting my client, and how is my client's culture, background, education, how does that inform how they show up in our sessions, in their work, in their communities. Anyway, long answer to your question. Did I answer your question?
You did. Okay. And you pulled a number of threads that I want to pursue and explore that it's so hard for me to choose. But even just on the topic of MBTI, when I had realized how big that was here, I decided, okay, maybe I should take it again and see what my categorization is.
Can I ask what you got?
Well, so a while ago it was INTJ, and it was very strong on the introversion scale. But I had taken this probably, I don't know, maybe 7-8 years ago was the last time I had taken it.
Right.
And then when I took it this time, I was, I think, INFJ, and my scale on the introversion was much less.
Yes.
But it was tricky, kind of to your point, to answer the questions, because the way that I'd interact or my responses to some of the prompts would have been different depending on the context that I was in. You know, if I was answering those questions while in Korea, it would have been very different than if I was in the States. Right. And that's one thing that just going back to the States this past holiday season, it was a reminder, is I feel so much more extroverted or extra American here. And then when I go back to the States, I feel a lot more introverted. So it is a very unusual thing. And I imagine that one of the things that I think is interesting about your background is the fact that you are multilingual. And I imagine that if I spoke Korean more fluently, that there would be different parts of my personality that would come up. Because one of the interesting things is talking to some young people here is they have a preference to interact with me in English as opposed to speaking Korean, because they feel like they're more free to speak openly. Yeah, Malcolm
Gladwell has a great story on this in terms of Korean Air. I don't know if you've heard this story, but essentially they forced all of their pilots to switch from Korean to English to get rid of the honorifics, the 존댓말, to make it easier for people to communicate effectively, because they would get into plane crashes when the captain would overrule the co-captain or whoever is second in command because of the nature of Korean and the nature of hierarchy and seniority. And yeah, I think those are features baked into the language. I also think that one of the things I've experienced, because I didn't speak much Korean when I was a kid. I actually chose not to go to Korean school because I had soccer practice on the weekends and I had to choose one. Yeah. And again, my brother was forced to go to Korean school. My parents thought that was very important. By the time it got to me, and I'm a bit more of a stubborn person in general, so I said no. And eventually they relented and let me play soccer. And so I didn't get that Korean language education. I started learning Hangul in high school, and then I started dating a Korean classmate of mine in high school, and then I had a Korean girlfriend in college. Those were two big turning points for me, where I wanted to have a connection to them and their families, and then I realized that I wanted a connection to my grandparents and to my parents in a different way. Why was it? It's not really fair to them to force my parents to use their second language in order to have a connection with me. And so from college, I decided to have a rule, which is that I only use Korean with my parents, at least primarily.
And when you were growing up, your parents spoke English to you most of the time, or did they speak Korean?
Both English and Korean.
Okay.
So just quick background on my family. So my mom immigrated to New York with her whole family. So 2 parents, 3 siblings. They all moved to New York at the same time. And my mom was 18. She was the youngest. And she went to university in New York. And so that, I think that's young enough where my mom actually feels very comfortable in America. She made friends in English. She likes reading in English. My dad came over for grad school, and this was after he went to Kunde, 2 years of military service. So he speaks English and worked in English, but it's always like kind of a professional language for him rather than an emotional language. So my dad usually speaks to us in 99% Korean, and then my mom would speak to us maybe in 80% Korean. But I would, as a kid, speak back to them 99% in English. And that was just the arrangement. And neither side wanted to change that until probably I went to university and then decided in order for me to have a genuine relationship with the culture, it's actually my responsibility to learn this language. And I know it's possible because you see non-Korean people who learn Korean fluently and they're brilliant at it.
Yep.
And I think one of the things that frustrates me is when people say, oh, you're good at languages. I don't believe that. I mean, to some extent, I'm lucky that I grew up in a bilingual household. So, of course, my brain, the neurons are already primed for that.
Yep.
But on the other hand, I think learning a language is hard for anybody, right? Anybody who can speak several languages knows how challenging it is to learn new vocabulary. You have to take lessons. And for me, I was very reluctant to learn Korean. I always felt very insecure about that because the benchmark that you're compared against is perfection. If you don't speak Korean like a Korean person, then something's wrong with you or something's off or you're not really Korean. That pressure, I think most diaspora feel that on some level, that I'm not accepted unless I speak fluently. But how can I speak fluently if I'm not accepted?
Yep.
And then, for example, when I started taking Korean lessons, my parents' first reaction was, oh, you don't need lessons. You can just talk with us. And then their second reaction was, how much are you paying your Korean teacher? You should just practice with us. Right?
Yeah.
And third was, oh, just use English. Like, you don't have to speak Korean all the time. When I really wanted to hear from them was, hey, thanks for putting in the effort and time and energy to learn this language at a higher level, even though it's uncomfortable, even though it makes you feel embarrassed. It's very admirable to take on that challenge. So yeah, always complicated with Korean. When it came to Japanese, I studied it in high school and a bit in university and did a homestay study abroad. I did some farming. I don't know if you've heard of woofing before.
I've heard of it, yes.
WWOOF, the Worldwide Organization of Organic Farms. I did a month or two stint in Japan right after high school. I was farming right next to Mount Fuji. It was beautiful, like, quiet life. And my Japanese level is similar to how I think Americans treat their Spanish. It's like something you learned in school, and maybe we're lucky to study abroad, but it's not a language that I use on a day-to-day basis. But then my fourth language was Chinese, and I started learning Chinese when I was 21. And I remember my parents saying things like, why are you trying to learn Chinese at 21? It's like a little too late for you. Like, who learns one of the hardest languages after your prime years of learning?
Yep.
But I really committed to it. So I took a gap year. I moved to Taiwan first, did a 9-month program there. I moved to Beijing. I did a 2-month program there. And then I just treated it like a real job. So I was in class, 30, 40 hours a week. I studied on my own 30, 40 hours a week. I tried to not use English as much as possible for that first year. And then eventually I ended up doing a master's in China, worked at Chinese startups, and I was using Chinese on a daily basis. And one of the most challenging parts of my career was when I joined a startup that basically treated me as their main sales marketing person. And my job was to be on the road every week. I would go to 1 or 2 different Chinese cities. And we're not talking like Shanghai, we're talking Xi'an, we're talking, Guangzhou, places that are considered tier 2 cities, where people don't really speak as much English. Some of them don't even speak Mandarin fluently. But my job was to give a 2-hour sales pitch in Mandarin and sell and close in Mandarin.
Wow.
And it was so difficult for me at first. And I had this script that, it was like 20 pages that I would try to memorize. And then eventually I could do it without the script. And eventually I could add a bit of charisma and add a little bit of sales tactics and understand the Chinese sales process. And, one of the funniest moments was a client came up after the presentation and approached my boss and said, "Hey, presentation was great, but why was that guy's Chinese so bad? Like, why don't you hire somebody with better Chinese?" And my boss had to explain that, oh, he's actually not Chinese and he's Korean. And then, of course, Chinese people are very kind, because if they know you're not Chinese, they will always compliment your Chinese. Even if you just say ni hao, they will be so excited to hear that you're learning Chinese. And so even though I wasn't supposed to learn Chinese, I don't have like a very strong tie to China, but every step along that process, I was always complimented, always encouraged, always welcomed. And like I said earlier, I felt like I could reinvent myself in China. There's a lot of privilege you have as an expat. And so psychologically, even though Chinese is a hard language, it felt like a very fun, dynamic, adventurous process. And so it's been 10 years. I've continued to take Chinese lessons an hour or two a week. I use it for work pretty regularly. And it's way better than my Korean. My Korean is only useful in my family. And maybe I use it on some dates. But even then, it's not, I don't have the command of the language the way I do with English, where I can be, humorous in the right way, or I can, kind of really adapt my personality to suit the situation. My Korean is really just meant for family. And in Chinese, I, wrote part of my master's thesis in Chinese. I read and write. I, do these sales pitches, or I make friends. And I've lived there for like 9 or 10 years now. So it feels very comfortable, very familiar. And it's just like what you mentioned last week, which is, it's not about where you're from. It's about where you feel like you're local, where you feel comfortable. And I definitely feel that in China in ways that I don't feel in Seoul.
Wow.
Because when I show up in China, I have friends. I know how to live there. I know all the apps. I know exactly how that system works. And it's so fun. It's so different from how Americans or Koreans think about China.
Yeah. And
I'm actually taking my brother-in-law, my sister-in-law's younger brother. I'm taking him on a trip to Shanghai next week.
Wow.
Just to show him, like, this is the China that I experience. And I love it so much. And so going back to that original question of, like, who am I and how do I introduce myself? When I meet a Korean person, I'll say I'm Korean American. When I meet an American person, I'll say that I'm Korean. And when I meet a Chinese person, I'll say I'm a Korean that was raised in America, but lived in China for 10 years and loves China. And they will then, most Chinese people will kind of take me in as an honorary in-group person, because I speak the language, I get them, I celebrate their culture. And I think not enough people do that, especially for China. Like right now, Korea is getting a lot of love internationally for culture and for food and whatnot. I don't know if that'll always be true, but I think for China right now, we're at a turning point where people are starting to appreciate China as it is today. And clearly they're doing a lot of wonderful things, and also some things that, rightfully we should criticize. But I think there's a lot of bias against China right now.
Yeah. This is why I find this conversation so interesting, is because I don't know a lot of English speakers who have spent extended periods of time in like mainland China. And so my perceptions of the country. So actually one of my closest friends from Stanford, he's from Qingdao. Oh, cool. And when I was an undergrad student, he took me to a few different cities in China. And to be quite honest, it was quite an intimidating experience. Just because
he took you through China?
Just a couple of cities like Shanghai and Beijing and Qingdao. Awesome. And it was a cool experience, but it was also very intimidating, and it just felt like chaotic. Sure. And obviously if you are navigating a country and you can speak the language, it's such a different experience that you have.
That's right.
So that's why I'm very curious to better understand like your China experience as well. But even to go back, like you had studied psychology and Asian studies as well.
That's right.
In undergrad.
That's right.
So this like interest with Asia in general, you knew like after you decided to go to boarding school and kind of had some sort of camaraderie with the other like international Korean students or Asian students in general. Did you know kind of where your life would be headed in terms of your aspirations? Okay.
Absolutely not. I think as far as high school goes, I entered high school wanting to win the American game, which what I mean by that is, go to the best school possible, go get the best internships, go get a impressive job that makes good money, marry a beautiful person who can be your best friend, and then kind of just like win that game, right? And I was surrounded by people who also saw it that way, and it was a highly competitive I definitely worked the hardest in my life in high school because I was sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night and surrounded by so many brilliant people. But what it made me realize was that, first of all, American schools are so, what do you call it? A Euro-American centric, right? So if you look at the way we structure history courses, it's American history, European history, and then world history. Like, what is that? You're going to lump all other, 150 countries outside of America and Europe as rest of the world. It's, in my opinion, very disrespectful and shows that America is still this like anglicized or this westernized place. How much time do we actually spend learning about indigenous Native American culture, Mexican culture? Very little time in my experience.
But in defense, and one question on that is, isn't that how most countries kind of operate? Is like, if you're growing up in Korea, sure. I would imagine that like the coursework would be like Korean studies would be the focal point. And then maybe after that, it would be like Asian studies in a broad sense. And then after that, it would be world history. Or do you think that with the US specifically, they have maybe a different proclivity to just focus on US centric types of history? I would imagine that it's kind of standard.
Yes and yes. Throughout. I think both of those points are true at the same time. So yes, of course, we should understand our national history, but at the same time, American superiority, what do you call that? American, like the sense of exceptionalism. Yep. That is stronger than any other place I've experienced. And the lack of curiosity about other places is particularly strong in America, whereas most countries don't have a choice. I mean, every other country in the world has to pay attention to American elections. Can Americans name the world leaders of other countries? Can Americans understand the politics of other countries? Even our allies like the UK and Germany, do we really understand the difference between prime minister and chancellor and president? No, I don't think so. I don't think the standards are very low for Americans to branch out. I forget the exact statistic, but I believe that only 1/3 of Americans have passports. And so most of those people use passports to go to like Canada and like the Caribbean and maybe France, maybe the UK, right? But how many Americans are trying to learn a foreign language and live in a foreign country? At least economically and culturally, there's no pressure forcing them to do that. I think the number of Chinese people that study abroad in America is something like 600,000 every year. And the number of Americans going to China is like less than 5,000 or something. It's shockingly small and makes zero sense when you think about how important China is and much less other countries. But I do think that Americans are particularly narrow-minded about this, and they are very complacent with that blind spot or that at least that area that they don't spend enough time examining. And, putting the whole question of curriculum aside, just as a Korean American, the message it sends to me is that Korea is unimportant. I'm an Asian based on my skin color, right? All the other identities between, let's say, North versus South Korea, Korea versus China and Japan, East Asia versus South Asia versus Southeast Asia, all of those nuances get wiped out. And it's highly humiliating to be treated that way. And it's even worse that nobody questions it. Nobody is actually saying, it would be great if we had a Korean studies course. We just don't have the funds for that. That's a different conversation than saying, well, let's just call it world history. and let's not give you an option. And of course, it takes resources to help people study different things, study abroad. Of course, there's lots of privilege in that. But what I observe is that lots of people with privilege, with the resources to study abroad or to try to explore other cultures, you don't take that opportunity because they're too busy trying to enrich themselves. That's what I've observed in my circles, and it frustrates me. And I've been working really hard to learn other languages, to broaden my horizons, to not make America the center of everything, and to imagine a world where America and English speakers don't dominate everything, right? And I think that one of the main reasons why I left America was to decolonize my brain, right? And to say that in a very non-political way, I just mean to say that the way I've been educated in English in American institutions forces me to think in a certain way. Like even the whole liberal conservative spectrum is just one very narrow spectrum. Whereas when you talk to Europeans, like they're far more progressive, right? And if you talk to Chinese people, they don't even think about politics the same way because they don't get a choice in their leader. And so there's just many ways of living life. And I do think some ways are better than others. At least there are ways that in my own life, I'm trying to pick and choose the best values, the best systems for myself, and try to live those values and try to influence communities to learn from each other. And my brother and my relatives are in New York City. Every time I go back to New York, I find that people are not that curious about what's going on in Asia. They'll ask a couple questions like, hey, why are you in Korea? Why are you in Asia? But then the conversation quickly goes back to, U.S. politics. And all of the things that are happening in Korea, the feminism movement or the president declaring martial law, those things make the headlines, but they're really just talking points to help people better understand America or bring the conversation back to, this is what American feminists are doing. This is what American politics, this is how it's relevant to American politics. What I wish people did was take a moment to consider that it's very difficult to form an informed opinion on any of this until you actually experience it firsthand. So I wish that people took more time to experience things firsthand, just like you're doing, moving here. You might have felt Korean American in America, but then once you land here, your understanding of Korea is going to change. Your firsthand experiences change. And then you stop looking at Koreans like one group and you start to see like there's the startup people, there's the corporate people, there's different generations. Depends on what neighborhood you live in Seoul. And the fact that we're in Seoul already colors our perception. Like once you get out to the countryside, even if you go out to Busan or Daegu, like you get very different experience, very different values. And then, that's part of the reason why I like spending more time in Korea. Is I get to see more diversity within Korea.
Well, even with the Cambridge effort, right, is like I named it that for a very specific reason. And it was because I didn't want to niche myself into a specific topic or a specific geography. You were talking about just the divisiveness within Korea in general, generationally.
Yes.
Even I see it very much so with the gender stuff as well, is like talking to guys and talking to girls. Right. You get a very different perspective on life here in Korea. Yeah. And I do hope, I imagine that my own experiences and my own educational background has kind of shaped the way that I understand the world in a very deep way to where there are some underlying biases. Sure. And there are aspects of like American culture that I have a great degree of value or appreciation for, like even with some of the events that we've held, right? Is like networking events in Korea. There's a different dynamic is what I understand in terms of approachability and willingness to share information. Yes. Is there's a lot more stuffiness. And it seems like what I've been surprised by is even Koreans that speak English well, they have found some appreciation for even the Cambridge networking events where it's English first. Yeah. But there's a little bit more of approachability and friendliness. And I feel like that is a much more of a Western style type of event to host, right? And I haven't seen a lot of that here. And so there's both the good and the bad, and I see it as well. And even with like the podcast in general, we were talking a little bit before, and one of the trickiness of podcasting is I'd love to have more like Korean profiles to share their story, but there is a very strong kind of fear of social like being judged or saying the wrong thing. Right. And I do think that maybe it is my more American mindset of like I can have a conversation with somebody, and if I say something stupid or if I say something that's like factually incorrect, like that's okay. You can correct it and just move forward. but that is not always the same way of thinking that people approach conversation, like Korean people approach conversation.
Sure. Yeah.
And so that's something that I've had to learn and adjust, because before, even with podcasting in general, I would ask Korean people that speak English, like, what podcast do you listen to? Because I'm a huge podcast nut.
What did they say?
Yeah, well, a lot of them don't listen to podcasts. And
what do they listen to?
Music. A lot of people are just YouTube first, so they watch YouTube content.
Because in Korean subways you get cell signal, so you can actually watch stuff. In New York, like, I'm so frustrated that my phone signal, cuts out when I'm passing through stations.
Yes. Yeah. But even like, to the point of why are there not more podcasts here? Maybe it's just a matter of time, but also I wonder the types of, like, news or media that they watch. It feels a lot more structured and formal.
Absolutely.
Right.
I mean, if you watch a news broadcast, I mean, there's only a handful of broadcasting companies in Korea, and they're super formal. The language they use on the news broadcast is not normal Korean.
Yeah.
And there's many reasons for that, but what I find interesting is, if I turn on my Korean brain right now and I think about, okay, if I'm a Korean person coming onto a podcast, first of all, who am I to be on a podcast?
Yeah.
Like, you invite me, it's like, no, Tiger, I am not an expert in anything.
Yeah.
Why would anybody want to listen to me? There's that humility aspect, which, by the way, I find very refreshing about Korean culture. I appreciate so much that, unlike Americans who tend to overinflate who they are and think that they're the center of the universe and want to hear their own voice, I find that Koreans have a lot of humility and shyness in ways that are very charming.
Absolutely.
But then if you're going to invite them on a podcast episode, they're going to struggle to maybe speak freely.
Yep.
The other thing that I would do as a Korean would be to start writing down talking points and have an agenda, right? And I found myself starting to do that, because I would feel insecure without that. I would feel like, oh, I can't perform well unless I'm prepared, and I have to think about what's my outfit, what's my tone of voice, and how do I speak very eloquently and put off the right image so that I'm impressive when somebody watches this episode. And so the moment I get into that brain space, that's, to me, very Korean.
Yes.
And again, I appreciate it in the right context, where you ask a Korean person to prepare a presentation, they'll prepare it really thoroughly. They'll spend time to prepare it. They'll be very diligent. They will show up on time. I was running late today, and the lady in the front called me out on it. She was like, "Hey, are you late for this?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, I'm running a little late." And she said, "It wasn't just a little late." And I don't even know her.
That's so funny.
Right? And it's like, wow, like, this whole culture takes life pretty seriously in ways that are great. And then when they party, they also take that seriously, which is also fun and great.
Yeah.
But I would say that the podcasting format lends itself to genuine, deep, unstructured conversations.
Yes.
It's not supposed to be a lecture.
Yep.
It's not supposed to be an expert, a sage on stage. And it was one of the questions I had for you coming onto this, which is, do you want this to be a conversation? Do you want me to ask you questions? Should it sound like two friends talking, or should it sound like we're trying to teach the audience about something? And I think in Korea, the assumption would be that we're listening to two experts who are here to teach us something. And my role as a listener is to be a student, and I have to take notes, and I have to, not necessarily think about what I would say. And that's kind of spontaneity is something that's usually it's more lacking. And again, going back to MBTI, I think part of the reason why people like that framework is because it normalizes, I'm an INFP, by the way. It normalizes that NFP part. I think there are lots of introverts in Korea, but the idea that I should use my intuition or my feelings, or I should not be judgy, is, I think, not rewarded in normal social or corporate settings. I think the perfect Korean worker is probably INTJ or ISTJ, like somebody who's just very structured, planned, reliable, consistent.
Yep.
A perfect employee, right? That's what you're rewarded for. And for me, when I try to do something unconventional or creative, I think there are people who discourage me from doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, oftentimes in religious contexts or even in philosophical contexts, there's always the like dichotomy between like chaos and order, and you want to have the right balance of both, because sometimes for a certain context or a certain situation, you need more order than you do chaos, and other times if you're trying to generate something creative or novel, you have to embrace like the chaos side of it.
Right.
And I feel like especially with podcasting, the ones that feel the most authentic, there is a degree of uncertainty and kind of like chaos of like that's what makes it exciting.
Right.
Is I don't know how you're going to respond or what direction you're going to take the conversation. And to me, that makes it the most fun, especially when there are new threads to pull on.
Right.
And I feel like it's tricky because the order dimension Korea is so good at, like surprisingly so.
Yes.
And that's why when it came here, you know, some people had asked me about how was your first few weeks when you got to Korea. And when I had spent time abroad previously, there was usually some sort of a calibration process that I needed to go through. Because it was so obvious, like I was navigating a foreign country and everything was so new to me and it was almost disorienting. But for me, when I arrived in Korea, and part of it is the like cultural background that I've had as well, in terms of I had heard the language from my grandparents before, and some of the foods were familiar and some of the smells. But to me, on day 2 or day 3, I felt very comfortable very fast.
Absolutely.
You know,
I see your Instagram. You're posting stories of Korean soups and rice. It's like, yeah, you get it. You know, that's the good stuff. And I think if you're able to feel comfortable in Korea like that, this country has so much to offer, right? There's so much richness in the culture, the food, the people, the landscapes, the hobbies. You know, the climbing scene in Korea is very unique, I think, and I love it. You know, it got me really passionate about climbing. But there's so much to explore and discover here. And you have to keep in mind that it's a small place. Like, yes, we have 50 million people. And yes, Seoul has like 26 million or whatever it is. But the landmass of Korea, you can drive across it in 4 or 5 hours. And then it's maybe the size of Pennsylvania, or it's like smaller than Pennsylvania, something like that. So it's remarkable how successful economically Korea's been. It's remarkable how organized our society is. And then, of course, because we grew so fast and our parents' generation is so radically different from our generation, much less our grandparents who lived through war, of course, we're going to have social, I call them illnesses, like things that are truly toxic, that are vestiges of former cultures. And the fact that, you know, up until very recently, teachers would hit students. I mean, Jaewook was talking about that last week, right? Where he would get hit by his parents for getting math questions wrong. That's not unfamiliar to a lot of Korean people. And if it's not hitting you, they'll certainly yell at you. They'll berate you. They'll make you stand out in the hallway by yourself and shame you. And I think that's something that every Korean that's grown up in Korea has experienced. I think it's quite normalized. And I don't, at least from my lens and my experiences, I'm very firm that that's a type of abuse. And like, I've been guilty of like yelling at people too and engaging in those kind of conflicts. But I think it's so important that Koreans can innovate from here. Now that we're materially successful, how do we continue to innovate and upgrade our software, our culture, our norms to be more safe, to be more caring, compassionate, to care less about materialism and more about relationships and community, to spend more time in nature. These are all things that I think there are cultures like Korea that, there are cultures outside of Korea that have already started to embrace those kind of values. And Korea is very capable of that. There are many people here who do that, but it hasn't really spread into the mainstream urban culture yet. And I think until it does, people will continue to suffer and dislike their jobs, dislike their the dating market. That's why people aren't getting married or having kids, is that this whole like pressure box does not help anybody feel comfortable or optimistic about their future.
And one of my deep convictions, and even with what I'm seeing as I'm building out Cambridge, is that the diaspora population, or even people that have just multicultural backgrounds like yourself, those are like the keys, in my opinion, to unlocking some of this change. You know, it's so fun and interesting for me to sit down and have a conversation with somebody that has had a very unique kind of like Korean upbringing, because even like with after I had published the episode with Jay and Jusuk. There was a Korean adoptee who he was sent to France when he was like 3 months old, was raised by white French parents, and was pretty isolated from like Korean communities for the most part. But then in his older age, he decided to spend more time in Korea.
Right.
And it was fun for me to just have a conversation with him because, I mean, he looked Korean by most measurements.
Right.
But then as we have more and more of a conversation, these different threads of how different his mind just works and operates was very, very obvious to me.
Right.
And it was the same thing when I was talking to Jusuk and Jay. Same thing as I'm talking to you, is the ability to navigate these different worlds it's like a superpower in many respects, you know?
I see it as a muscle. You know, it's just like with learning a new skill like weightlifting or bouldering, you have to practice it to make it strong. And of course it's hard. It's a heavy weight to lift, and then you can put in those reps, develop your own methodology, and then it feels natural and easy after you do that. But there's a lot of growing pains for sure. There's a steep learning curve to that. And of course, there's lots of privilege involved too. Like Jusuk was mentioning about how he got the government to fund his ticket to come to Korea. But back in the 80s, it was very expensive to come to Korea. And like you mentioned, you have to prepare all these gifts, and there's a lot of other added costs. I would say now it's probably cheaper than ever to travel between the places, because just logistically it's a lot easier, it's a lot more streamlined. There's more examples of other people doing it, so it's not you don't have to reinvent the wheel to immigrate between the countries. But that being said, you know, things like visa questions we talked about last time, there's a lot of barriers for people to become more multicultural, multilingual. It's not easy. But then again, it's our responsibility as people with that privilege to give back or to help unlock doors, you know, not gatekeep any of this stuff, but to really support people and encourage them. And when they show up to Korea, to provide a community to them. And I think that's what Cambridge has become already in the first, you know, years that, you know, I flew in to come join the first event of this year, and, you know, I knew maybe 5 people there, and I invited a couple people, but then I met 20 other people that I immediately could click with and had some shared experiences with. And so when you're talking about that adoptee who reached out to you, what comes to mind is that Koreanness is partly an appearance thing. It's partly an ethnicity. It's also a nationality, which we don't have Korean nationality. Right. And then it's a culture, which, you know, I've been living and breathing this culture for a little bit longer than you, but you're also committing to it full time right now in a way that I haven't. So the fact that you live in your own apartment and you're creating this organization, starting a business and working out of the global startups office, you already have more knowledge and insight into Korean society than I do, in at least in those respects. And so between nationality, ethnicity, culture, how do we define Koreanness? What qualifies you to be Korean? You know, what do we really mean by that? I think it's really easy to take for granted that if you were born in Korea and you are educated here, then therefore you're Korean. But then what about the foreigners who are not ethnically Korean, but they love Korean culture, they love K-pop, they speak Korean fluently, they work at a Korean company? I would argue they're more Korean than I am, you know? And certainly somebody who speaks more Korean than me, I have a deep respect for, especially if they learned it as a second language. Deep respect for that. And it's a reminder to me that that's also possible for me, right? I'm not stuck at my current level of Korean. I am more than capable of hiring a tutor, finding a few hours a week to do that. And I know you're starting that journey too.
I need a kick in the butt to get myself going more intensely on that process.
It's hard though. It's genuinely hard. And I see it as hard as, you know, for somebody who's never worked out before to start working out, or for somebody who has never cooked before to start cooking. It really is as difficult, if not more difficult, because society, because you look Korean, will expect you to speak better Korean. And so you're kind of climbing uphill. And it's strange to have to hire your own teacher because you're not in school anymore. So as an adult, like, when do we ever hire a tutor and start with Korean 101 and, you know, say, you know, my family has 4 people or whatever textbooks start with? It's highly uncomfortable and highly boring. But that is the barrier to entry, and once you overcome that, like, it unlocks so much.
Yes.
Right. The moment that you can have a conversation in Korean, make a friend in Korean, make a friend with somebody who's never learned English or has never left Korea before. I think that's the other side of K-Bridge, which is that it's really easy for us right now to use English and make friends with other English speakers.
Mm-hmm.
But then what about like the Spanish Kyopos that don't speak English? They only speak Spanish and Korean, Their bridge will be to Koreans first, I think. And I think to your point, we need as many of those nodes as possible, right? We need as much diversity as possible in this K-Bridge community. And of course, like, we want this to be inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that historically Koreans are not very good at being inclusive because they're more concerned with in-group, out-group dynamics.
Yes.
Right? Are you my people? Can I drink with you? Can I work with you?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else is out-group.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of those key things that bridgers or K-Bridge, K-Bridgers are going to be good at is being really comfortable in that sort of ambiguous identity of, we'll use a bit of English, we'll use a bit of Korean, we'll be a bit of that culture, this culture, and everybody's welcome. And I think that's the antidote to some of the stuffiness that you described earlier, which is that how often in Korea can you just meet a stranger who doesn't work in the same industry, didn't go to the same school as you? It's very rare. And that's why we have this whole blind dating culture, like sogeting, where, we need an introduction from somebody else, and it needs to be the person with the right specs, the right background, in order to even qualify to speak with me. And even then, I'm going to judge them on whether they're wearing the right thing, they have the right hobbies, they have an apartment or a car. It's just so many ways of judging and ranking people in Korea. Yeah.
One of the challenges that I've had is, even in terms of building relationships with people here in Korea, even if they are very good at speaking English, is just the time it takes to build up the trust.
Yes.
Is so long.
Yes.
That's
right.
And when it comes to just projects, K-Bridge collaborations, even having a podcast conversation, it makes things tricky. Whereas if I meet somebody from the US or from Europe and I'm just like, even you, right? Let's just try a podcast and see what happens. It's like, it's easy to do that, but it's one of the things, and one of my hopes is that for founders, both like Korean founders that have a global mindset, and for Korean American founders, that there's some more like cross collaboration or even discussion between the two. But it's going to be a very tricky process to make that kind of cross collaboration work. I don't even know if it's going to be possible, because even at large universities that have clubs, usually you have your Korean Student Association, which is like international students,
right,
and then you have your Korean American communities.
That's
and
right.
Usually they're pretty distinct from each other.
That's right.
And even for myself, like at Stanford, I wasn't a part of either of those, because I felt like my whole identity was going to be like kind of submerged within that group.
That's right.
Yeah,
it's like a fraternity.
Yes.
You kind of have to sign up to initiate yourself and follow the rules and be part of the group. And I think there's value in that, right? Obviously, we need safe spaces or, affiliations like that, and that's great. I think what you're speaking to, though, is, again, bridging different groups and allowing for more cross-pollination.
Yes.
It is a little bit counter to human nature, to be frank with you. Like, it's if you think about in the ancient times, like, what kind of people would leave their country and like set up roots in a new country. It's very rare, and it's like the intrepid explorer / the pirate / the the wandering monk or something like that. But there are definitely rewards waiting for you if you can take that first step to live outside of your country for a bit. I would say, though, that there is a difference between the person who decides to be a tourist, let's say for a few weeks up to a couple months, versus the person who puts down roots for a year or two, versus the person who's put down roots for 5 to 10 years plus, and then maybe start a family and whatnot. The level of community and trust you can build changes radically. And I think for you and me, we're used to a culture where it's okay to switch your job every year or two. It's okay to quit your job and take a gap year, or work on a startup or move to a new country. Doesn't surprise anybody in our circles. But I think for most people in the world, any one of those decisions would be life-changing and scary and risky, especially in a place like Korea, where who can often determine your success in life. if you're in the right circles, if you're connected to the right families and the right famous people, that could completely, literally determine your life more so. So we call that, there's a phrase for that in cross-cultural studies. I think it's ascription, like whether we ascribe value to people based on their backgrounds or based on their competency. And in general, as a generalization, Americans tend to focus more on your capabilities. So sure, Tiger, you went to Stanford, good for you, right? But what can you do the work, right? And sure, it'll help you in your hiring process, but at the end of the day, somebody from a no-name college, somebody who didn't go to college, could still outcompete you.
Yep.
We kind of know that, and we kind of actually idolize people who dropped out of college and went to community college, but then still make it.
Right.
That's a great underdog story. In Korea, like, good luck. If you don't come from the right university, your whole life might be screwed.
Yep.
Whereas if you come from the right family, you'll be a millionaire for life. You know, your parents might buy you your apartment and your car, and then you can get married, and what do you need to really worry about in your life?
Yep.
Now, of course, those lives are not easy too. I know people like that who they don't live easy lives, but my point is that in Korea, your background and who you are, who you're connected to, is very important, and your reputation is very important. So the risk of coming onto a podcast, the risk of making a new friend, is a little scarier than to somebody like us who is used to taking risk. And also, like, if we fail, what really happens? Like, we can always go back to America, get a good job. You know, life doesn't end for us. And so I think there is privilege in that too. But again, people with privilege need to use it. We need to leverage our ability to make risks or take risks, make experiments, and then try stuff like Cambridge, because then there's a chance for creating something new, something that people desperately need, but nobody really has the capacity to do it. At least not until Tiger shows up on the scene.
Well, it's funny because I don't think it's completely coincidental that like me, as somebody who is so distant from Korean culture, came here and decided to start something like this, right? I was wondering for a long time why somebody didn't do anything like this. Right. And I guess the only other example is really Chuseok and Jae, who both have international backgrounds as well.
That's right.
Right? And so I do think the mixing of cultures creates new opportunities. And in terms of Cambridge and the degree to which it is successful, I do hope it's just like a place where people who are willing to take some risks can make new possibilities, right?
That's right.
That's definitely my hope.
In my understanding, I know we're coming up on time.
Yep.
I wanted to quickly ask you a couple questions because I think this is relevant to your ability to kind of take these risks. Because I'm curious to learn more about your parents, because when I think about, for example, you went to Stanford, and that's like most Korean parents' dream. And you go to Stanford, and then you go into finance or law or something like that, and you're celebrated in Korean, in that society. You're celebrated, and so many opportunities open up for you. And then what I can imagine for a lot of Koreans is that if they come to Korea and try to do a startup, there's always going to be a nagging voice to say, well, that sounds really risky, or, well, maybe you shouldn't do that. Maybe you should stick to the conventional path. Maybe you should be successful the way that we think about success. And there's a lot of pressure there. And I feel that to some extent, and I have to fight really hard with my parents. I mean, my parents are amazing. They want the best for me. They do give me a lot of freedom. And yet I still feel like I have to, on almost a daily basis, fight that narrative and fight that expectation. And I'm curious for you, do you experience that kind of struggle with your parents, or do you find that part of the reason why you're here and part of the reason why you're able to do a startup is because your parents support you in that and they encourage that risk-taking? Or you've already done your duty by going to Stanford, so everything else is fine because you've already crossed that hurdle. Yeah.
As it relates to even my own path, right, is so much of it was self-imposed. Like, I had high standards for myself and high expectations for myself. And I think the fact that my parents were not kind of always on me about like performing, it was a big advantage for me in terms of the freedom and flexibility that I've had with my career, you know? Right. So even like some of my other siblings, like my parents, they always wanted me and my siblings to put our best foot forward in any endeavor that we undertook. And athletics was a big forum. So I would say like even for my dad, like there was maybe more of an emphasis or a priority around athletics than there was around school.
And is that because your dad grew up in the States?
Definitely so.
Where did he grow up?
Also Chicagoland area. He immigrated maybe when he was like 7-8 years old, both my mom and my dad.
What sports did he play?
American football.
Did he want you to play football?
The danger aspect of it, he was, so even my younger brother, he's at Carnegie Mellon right now, and he's a wide receiver, like freshman.
Oh, wow, cool.
So,
nice.
I think my dad, he wanted us to try things athletically. I was very small, so I don't know if football was going to be the right path for me. But I played a lot of competitive soccer when I was younger.
Nice.
So
you're going to play on Jay's league?
I don't know if I'm cut out for that at this point.
You're definitely cut out for it. I don't know if you have time for it, but
I want to explore some opportunities. I was telling him on the podcast before, I don't know if you heard this part, but even if we could create a little like 3-on-3 like World Cup scenario within the Cambridge ecosystem, I feel like that would be a lot of fun. Nice. But just to go back to your question in terms of like my parents, much more of an American mindset than of a traditional Korean mindset.
So what does that sound like to you? Like what were the kind of messages they would send you?
Pursue your passion. You know, like what is it that interests you? That while like money and career success, those are in terms of covering your bases and making sure that you have a comfortable life so that you're not like on the streets and homeless. Right. Like those things matter. But after that, you should more so be focused on how you're cultivating your values, right? And what kind of person you're going to become. And that to them was a lot more important than me going to Stanford and starting my career at Goldman. Like even when I was considering leaving the Wall Street path, like I had called my mom and said like, you know, I don't know if this is the path for me. I'm thinking about just like quitting on the job. And she was like, you should do that. So
how did they react to you when you were taking that offer?
They were happy for me. I mean, they were happy for me because that was the path that I wanted to pursue.
Your goal.
You know, and I knew like, because I did come from a lower income background, money for me had always been top of mind. Right. And having some financial stability was something that I wanted for myself. Right. And, you know, Wall Street seemed to be the path to get there. Sure. And it was only through going to Goldman and having that experience and realizing that there are trade-offs that you're going to have to make, some of which you probably don't want to make, whether it's time freedom or even the people that you get to associate with, to where it was more and more obvious to me my life was becoming a little bit too predictable as well. Right. You know? Right. And I wanted to see what else was out there.
And then how did they react when you were starting Cambridge? And did you even care what they thought?
I mean, the idea of moving to Korea, that was an idea that I had for a while, just to take like a sabbatical. Right. Because I did do 2 internships when I was in undergrad in Japan. Oh, cool. And I always had thought it was awesome that I got to spend some time in Tokyo and be exposed to this whole new world. It was extremely formative, but it would have been maybe more unique if I had some time in Seoul as well, just because of my own background and heritage. Right. So it was always in the back of my mind of that was a really cool experience. Maybe someday I should just visit Korea and see what life is like there. And this is something that I had told my parents, and for them, it was more so like, oh yeah, that's nice. One day you can do that, but likely nothing would happen. You know, they kind of just push it off as a passing thought. You know, because everybody says like, oh, it would be nice to go to this place or that place, right? Yeah. It was only until I said like, hey, I'm gonna save money up while I'm in my 9-to-5, and then at the end of the year, I'm gonna quit my job and I'm gonna go. Right. It was only then they were like, hey, maybe you should think more about this. Are you sure you want to do this? You don't really have a plan. So they were encouraging me on all dimensions, but obviously there's a little bit of worry of like why leave a very comfortable, stable path that had a clear career progression. Right. So they mostly just wanted to make sure that I was being thoughtful about the decision, and it wasn't something impulsive.
It sounds like at every step of the way, though, they're never imposing their values or their expectations on you. And I think I don't know if there are any parents listening today, but if there are, that's something that I think is really important that Korean parents don't fully understand, which is that if they are more concerned with asserting their vision and their expectations, it will undermine the confidence that children have in their own values and their own path. And it sounds like your parents deserve a lot of credit for giving you that flexibility while also, like, you know, considering some of the potential risks.
Yep.
But they're still saying, hey, Tiger, you're in control of your life. And what we think, you know, well, maybe is a little important, but it's totally up to you. And they support your passions. And I think that's a very, I would say a more American way of parenting.
Yep.
And I wonder how much of that gives you that sort of confidence to then do a startup. Whereas one thing that feels very common in a lot of the Koreans that I meet is that their parents, there's a voice that's coming from their parents that's discouraging them from dating the person they want to date or doing the job they want to do or taking time off to travel. Like, you always constantly have to think about what are other people going to think about this decision, especially parents. And that's like a complicated psychological burden I think a lot of Koreans face. But I'm really glad that your parents are supportive.
So when I was in like 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, my parents homeschooled me and my 2 older siblings.
Interesting. What was the reason for that?
And she didn't feel like we were getting much out of standard public education.
Sure.
And she did want to embrace, I would say, more unconventional forms of learning. Cool. So we would go on a lot of field trips, right? And we do like a lot of independent study, and we would just have like extended recess where we would play outside and like interact with nature a lot more.
Nice.
So, I mean, I don't know. It's hard. It's always hard to draw kind of causation conclusions around your upbringing. Sure. But I do think that it influenced me in some type of way. And it is unfortunate, but it is also a reality that most Korean Americans that were born and raised with more traditional Korean parents, they have the equation is different for them. You know, I don't know if I would have felt comfortable making the same types of life decisions that I've made in terms of leaving the prior path that I was on if I also had some like deep pressures from my parents around where I was taking my life. So I'm definitely very grateful for that.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Love to meet your parents someday. They're interesting people.
Yeah. Hopefully they'll be out. They'll be able to visit at some point for like some Cambridge event.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah. Man, there's so much that I wanted to get to.
We're hitting time.
We've got 5 minutes left here. Yeah. Maybe I'll ask you this, which is for the remainder of like 2025, in terms of your own personal goals and aspirations. I know you have a big move coming up. I don't know whether or not you can share too much about that.
Absolutely.
But in terms of what you're excited about and the types of people that you enjoy meeting and interacting with, there was a whole conversation that we could have had around your coaching journey.
Sure.
That I wanted to ask you about, but we'll have to do another podcast conversation at some point. But can you share a little bit about your plans for this year and what you're excited about?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the new things that I've taken on recently is that I've joined the faculty of a leadership institute. So we teach International Coaching Federation style of coaching. It's like one of the credentials for becoming a coach, a professional coach. And so I have my own independent practice as an executive coach, focusing on a lot of this cross-cultural communication pieces. And then this institute is based in Philly. So I'll be helping teach some of their curriculum for the next batch of coaches. And then I'm actually moving to New York City starting in April. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, my older brother, he's 4 years older than me. He's having a baby. Wow. And so I'm going to be first-time uncle. That's very awesome. Excited for that responsibility and want to be present for that. The second reason is that I've spent, 10 years after graduating from college based in Asia. And I feel very comfortable here. I feel like I've learned a lot here. But I haven't really pursued my professional identity, my career outside of Asia. And being in New York is a new challenge for me in a kind of counterintuitive way. I'm very familiar with that culture, but I haven't really embraced what my career could look like if I were to develop it with at least a foot in North America. And the third reason would be just a change of pace. I think that I've been more or less based in Korea for the past few years. I understand how this lifestyle works, at least the way that I live it. And New York offers so much diversity, racial diversity, cultural diversity, class diversity. I'm hoping to take jazz lessons in New York and join the climbing gym and join a run club and go on dates. And like, there's lots of things that I want to do in New York at this age that I feel like, just like you have this unique moment to come to Korea and not have a super concrete plan because you don't have that many responsibilities tying you to a specific place.
Yep.
I also feel that way right now. Unique time of my life to be flexible. And again, something that Jay mentioned last time was you don't have to choose. So something that I've worked through with my coach and my therapist is that I am a multidimensional person, and people always ask me, well, where's your home? Where's your base? Is it Korea or the US or somewhere else? And I don't feel I need to answer that question, at least not for me. They might need to know just logistically, where am I going to be?
Right.
If you want to date me or you want to work with me, it would help to know where I'm going to be. And of course, I'll try to be as transparent about that as possible. But for me personally, in my growth as an individual, I want to go where I'm treated well. I want to go where my energy is, my curiosity lies, and where the opportunities are. And for this next 6-month season, I'll be in New York. And then I'll probably come back to Asia. And, in my dream world, if I'm allowed to really fantasize about if I had unlimited resources, what would I do? I would want to spend, 3-4 months in Korea, 3-4 months in New York, 3-4 months traveling the world and experiencing new cultures. That sounds great. And it's more possible now. It's not quite yet possible for me. Like, I definitely have responsibilities and financial considerations, but it's more possible now than ever before because so much of my work is online. I have friends all over the world, and maybe through K-Bridge, we'll be able to expand this network even further and get to meet up with Kyopos in Brazil and, wherever we end up. Yeah. So that's like a really cool vision that I think is more and more possible, thanks largely in part to your work. So very excited about that for this year. I have that six month lease in New York as like an anchor, but what happens before and after and during, I'm going to sort of follow the winds and see where it takes us.
Amazing. One of my hopes for this year is to host some regional K-Bridge events outside of Korea, right? Whether that's like Southeast Asia, but also in the US. And now that you'll be based in New York, hopefully we can do a fun like New York K-Bridge hangout, and then get perfect. Like a couple climbing sessions in while I'm there.
Let's do that. That sounds great.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brian.
Thank you, Tiger. Appreciate it.